Picture a flat stretch of Arkansas farmland, 3 runways cutting through it like scars, and on every inch of pavement around them, wingtip to wingtip, sits an airplane. Not 1 or 2. Thousands. Bombers with their engines still smelling of oil. Fighters with fewer than 100 hours in the air. Aircraft that cost the United States government a fortune to build, flown here not to fight, but to die. And somewhere on that field, 2 furnaces are about to swallow 10,000 of them whole. This is the story of how America destroyed its own Air Force with its own hands, and almost nobody outside of Arkansas remembers it happened. You've probably heard about the atomic bomb. You've probably heard about D-Day. But have you ever heard about Walnut Ridge? Because in 1946, this small town became the site of one of the strangest mass destructions in American history, a place where B-32 Dominator bombers, fresh off the assembly line, never fired in anger, were cut into pieces and melted down into ingots small enough to stack on a truck. Why would a country do that, just 1 year after winning the deadliest war in human history? The answer involves money, politics, a stunned local economy, and a decision made so quickly that most of the pilots who flew those planes in never knew where they'd end up. Stick with this one. It gets stranger the deeper you go. To understand why Walnut Ridge became a graveyard, you first have to understand what America built to win the war in the first place. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States turned itself into the largest aircraft factory the world had ever seen. Detroit stopped making cars and started making bombers. Women who had never worked outside the home became riveters, welders, and inspectors on assembly lines that ran day and night. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, American factories had produced roughly 300,000 military aircraft, not over the course of a decade. In under 5 years, B-17 Flying Fortresses rolled off the line in Seattle. B-24 Liberators poured out of Willow Run in Michigan at a rate that once hit 1 finished bomber every 63 minutes. Fighters like the P-40 Warhawk and the P-51 Mustang were built by the tens of thousands, engines screaming off test runways before being shipped straight to the front. Walnut Ridge, Arkansas, was part of that machine from the start, though not as a factory. It opened in October 1943 as an Army Air Forces training base built for over 5,000 military personnel with 3 5,000-foot runways and a sprawling 63-acre parking apron. Young men from across the country came here to learn how to fly before shipping out to Europe or the Pacific. It was one small cog in an enormous production and training system that was, by any measure, one of the greatest industrial achievements in human history. And then, almost overnight, none of it was needed anymore. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. On September 2, 1945, so did Japan. And the machine that had built an air force capable of winning a 2-front global war suddenly had nothing left to build for. Factories that had been running triple shifts went silent within weeks. Contracts worth billions of dollars were cancelled in a single stroke. Soldiers and airmen wanted to go home, and they did, by the millions, flooding back into a civilian economy that had no idea what to do with them. But there was another problem, one far less talked about than the celebrations in Times Square. What do you do with an air force that no longer has a war to fight? The numbers were almost incomprehensible. The United States had somewhere in the neighborhood of an unimaginable stockpile of surplus military aircraft sitting on runways and in storage across the country, planes that had either never seen combat or had barely finished their service. Every single one of them had cost taxpayers real money, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars per unit in wartime dollars. And every single one of them was now, officially, worthless to the government that built it. Storing them wasn't free either. Airplanes rust, rubber rots, instruments corrode. The longer these machines sat exposed to the weather, the less anyone would ever pay for them. The government needed to act, and it needed to act fast. That responsibility fell to an agency called the War Assets Administration, working alongside the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and they made a decision that would define the post-war fate of American air power. 6 major sites across the country were chosen to receive the flood of surplus aircraft, places with enough open land and long enough runways to handle the sheer volume. Kingman in Arizona, Clinton in Oklahoma, Ontario in California, Albuquerque in New Mexico, Altus in Oklahoma, and Walnut Ridge, Arkansas. There was no easy way to make this decision. Selling the planes back into private hands raised uncomfortable questions in Washington. Handing thousands of combat-capable fighters and bombers to civilian buyers, foreign governments, or even friendly nations meant handing over technology that had only months earlier been treated as a matter of national security. Keeping the entire fleet in reserve, ready for some future conflict, sounded appealing on paper, but the cost of maintaining tens of thousands of aircraft indefinitely, fueling them, guarding them, protecting them from the elements, was a bill nobody in the post-war government wanted to sign. Scrapping was, in the coldest possible sense, the cheapest option on the table. It converted a liability into raw material, and raw material into cash. It just happened to also mean burning through machines that young men had died flying. The government also had one eye on the shifting nature of warfare itself. Just weeks before Japan's surrender, the jet age had already begun to make its first appearance, and every propeller-driven Warhawk and Mustang sitting on a runway somewhere was, technically, already becoming obsolete. Why maintain an aging fleet of piston-engine fighters when the next war, whatever it turned out to be, would almost certainly be fought by a new generation of aircraft altogether? That calculation made scrapping easier to justify in budget meetings, even if it meant destroying machines that, in some cases, had barely left the factory floor. But nothing could have prepared this quiet Arkansas town for what was about to land on its runways. Beginning in 1945, aircraft began arriving at Walnut Ridge in numbers that seem almost fictional today. On the busiest days, as many as 250 airplanes touched down in a single 24-hour period. Pilots ferried them in from bases and factories across the country, sometimes flying planes that had never once carried a bomb or fired a shot, landed one final time, taxied to a parking spot, shut the engine down, and simply walked away. By the time the flood slowed, somewhere between 10,000 and 11,000 American warplanes had been flown into Walnut Ridge for storage and eventual disposal. Curtiss P-40 Warhawks were parked nose-up in long rows, tails resting on the ground, wedged vertically just to save space. Rows of B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses stretched towards the horizon. And scattered among them sat something even stranger, a bomber most Americans have never heard of at all. The consolidated B-32 Dominator was supposed to be a backup plan for the B-29 Superfortress, a heavy bomber rushed into production in case the B-29 program failed. It never got the chance to prove itself in any meaningful way before the war ended. Only 118 were ever built. And of those, at least 65, some records say 67, were flown directly to Walnut Ridge, many of them straight from the assembly line in Fort Worth, Texas, without ever completing a single combat mission. Picture that for a moment. A brand new heavy bomber, engineered and built at enormous cost, flying its very first and only flight straight into a scrapyard. The men who flew these ferry missions weren't combat pilots anymore. They were essentially delivery drivers for the dying days of an air force, logging one last flight in machines that had, in some cases, never carried a bomb load or fired a shot in anger. Local residents around Walnut Ridge remembered the sound above all else, the constant drone of engines overhead, day after day, as one aircraft after another dropped out of the sky and rolled to a stop. Farmers working fields near the base watched fighters and bombers streak overhead in numbers that dwarfed anything they'd seen during the war itself, when security had kept most operations quiet. Now in peacetime, the sky over rural Arkansas was busier with military aircraft than it had ever been while the war was actually being fought. Now here's where the story takes its darkest turn. At first, the government tried to sell what it could. Civilian buyers, small airlines, and foreign governments picked up transport aircraft and trainers for what today would be considered pocket change. Southern Baptist College, a small local institution near Walnut Ridge, purchased a pair of transport planes, a C-47 and a C-46, reportedly for somewhere between $600 and $800 each. As demand dried up, prices kept falling. Basic BT-15 trainers, once expensive military hardware, were eventually being sold off for around $250 apiece. But fighters and heavy bombers were a different story entirely. There simply wasn't a civilian market for a P-40 Warhawk or a 4-engine bomber. Nobody needed one. Nobody wanted the fuel bills, the maintenance, or the liability. And so, as 1946 wore on, thousands of combat aircraft sat rotting on the Arkansas apron with no buyer in sight. In September 1946, the decision was made. The Texas Railway Equipment Company placed a winning bid for 4,865 aircraft stored at Walnut Ridge, the vast majority of them fighters and bombers, for a total price of just over $1,800,000. Do the math on that for a second. Thousands of combat aircraft, machines that had cost the American taxpayer many multiples of that figure to build even a fraction of, sold off in bulk for scrap value. Warplanes that had once represented the cutting edge of American military technology were now worth less, per unit, than a used automobile. 2 massive smelting furnaces were constructed on the southwest corner of the ramp at Walnut Ridge specifically for this purpose. And then the destruction began in earnest. Workers moved through the rows of parked aircraft, first stripping out anything of independent value. Engines, instruments, radios, armament, anything that could be resold separately was pulled before the airframe itself was touched. What remained? The wings, the fuselage, the tail sections that had once carried young Americans through flak-filled skies over Germany and the Pacific, was cut apart with saws and torches into pieces small enough to feed into the furnace. Inside the smelters, the aluminum melted down into liquid, then poured into massive ingots for shipping and resale to industries hungry for cheap raw metal. A machine built for war became scrap metal for peacetime industry, sold by the pound. What happened next shocked even people who thought they understood how ruthless post-war demobilization would be. This wasn't limited to fighters and bombers considered obsolete or outdated. Aircraft with only a handful of flight hours went into the furnace right alongside planes that had flown dozens of combat missions. The B-32 Dominators, some of the newest heavy bombers in the entire American arsenal, sat awaiting the smelter alongside battle-worn veterans. Age didn't matter. Combat record didn't matter. Historical significance didn't matter. If an aircraft couldn't be sold, it was melted, full stop, and the process moved with brutal efficiency. Within roughly 2 years of the Texas Railway Equipment Company's purchase, virtually every one of those thousands of aircraft had been reduced to raw aluminum. And Walnut Ridge wasn't even unique. It was simply one node in a nationwide operation of staggering scale. Between 1945 and June 1947, the War Assets Administration processed roughly 34,700 surplus American aircraft for sale to be flown again, whether by civilians, airlines, or foreign buyers. But nearly 26,900 more, primarily front-line combat types, were sold specifically to be scrapped. Kingman, Arizona, ran a nearly identical operation to Walnut Ridge, its rows of B-17 photographed by the National Archives in haunting black and white, aircraft that look almost brand new sitting silent under the desert sun, waiting for the same fate. Ontario, Albuquerque, Altus, Clinton. 6 sites, one enormous and largely forgotten campaign to erase the physical evidence of America's wartime industrial might. But the story hides secrets most people, even dedicated aviation history fans, have simply never heard. Consider this. Some of the fighters awaiting destruction weren't simply melted down. A number of P-40s and other combat aircraft were repurposed before their end, stripped down and used for target practice, or converted into unmanned drones for anti-aircraft gunnery training. A Grumman F-6F Hellcat with no pilot inside could be flown by remote control straight into a live fire exercise. A plane that had once dueled with Japanese Zeros in the Pacific, now serving as a moving target for trainees who had never seen combat. Some of these drone conversions would go on, years later, to be used in early testing for the atomic-age anti-aircraft missile programs of the 1950s, a strange and rarely discussed thread connecting the propeller-driven war machines of 1945 to the dawn of the missile age. Consider this too. The smelters at Walnut Ridge themselves didn't last much longer than the airplanes they consumed. Once the scrapping operation wound down, the two furnaces that had melted thousands of American warplanes were torn down in 1952, leaving almost no physical trace that they had ever existed. Today, if you visit Walnut Ridge Regional Airport, built directly on the site of the old airfield, there is little to suggest that this quiet stretch of Arkansas tarmac was once the final resting place for some of the rarest bombers America ever built. Consider, too, the strange local footnote almost nobody outside Lawrence County has ever heard. When the destruction wound down and the base was no longer needed, roughly 60% of the land was handed over to the city of Walnut Ridge for use as a public airport, the very same runways that once received 250 warplanes a day. A local institution, Southern Baptist College, took possession of 122 acres of the former base and used it to build student housing. Where fighters once sat wingtip to wingtip awaiting the torch, students now walked to class, most of them with no idea what had unfolded on that ground just a few years earlier. And here is perhaps the strangest twist of all. While the title of stories like this one often gets simplified to bombers alone, the truth uncovered in the surviving records is a little more complicated, and honestly, more staggering. The overwhelming majority of what arrived at Walnut Ridge wasn't heavy bombers at all. It was a mixed tidal wave of nearly every type of American combat aircraft, fighters, trainers, transports, and bombers together, numbering somewhere close to 11,000 machines total. The real number that should shock you isn't just how many bombers were destroyed. It's that an entire air force, built to defeat two empires simultaneously, was unmade in barely 2 years. So what does any of this actually mean for us today, decades later? The scrapping of Walnut Ridge and its sister sites marked one of the largest and most rapid disposals of military technology in world history, and it set a precedent that would echo for decades. It established the pattern the United States would follow again and again after Korea, after Vietnam, after the Cold War itself ended. A recurring cycle of massive wartime build-up, followed by ruthless, efficient post-war teardown. It's the same logic that today governs the aircraft Boneyard at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, where retired military aircraft sit in the desert by the thousands, sometimes preserved, sometimes cannibalized for parts, sometimes eventually scrapped just like their propeller-driven ancestors were in 1946. A small number of aircraft type from those post-war scrapping years survived, saved by private collectors, museums, or simple bureaucratic accident, and those survivors are treasured today precisely because of how rare they've become. Of the 118 B-32 Dominators ever built, most were destroyed at Walnut Ridge or Kingman. Today, not a single complete B-32 exists anywhere in the world. Not one. The rarest heavy bomber America built during the Second World War was, quite literally, melted down for scrap metal within a year of the war's end. and no complete example survived to tell its own story in a museum. Every photograph, every serial number, every eyewitness account is all that remains of an entire aircraft type. Compare that to the survival rate of aircraft that happened to catch a lucky break, sold to civilian buyers or foreign air forces before the scrapping bids went through. A handful of P-40S and P-51s escaped the smelter simply because a buyer showed up at the right moment with the right amount of cash. Those same aircraft today sell at auction for well over $1 million each, restored to flying condition and paraded at air shows as priceless artifacts. The line between a museum piece worth a fortune and a pile of aluminum ingots sold by the pound came down to nothing more than timing, paperwork, and whether the right buyer happened to be looking in September 1946 instead of October. It's worth pausing on what this teaches us about how nations treat the machines of war once the shooting stops. Every conflict since has followed some version of the same script. Aircraft carriers scrapped or sunk as artificial reefs, tanks melted down or buried in surplus lots, rifles sold off by the crate to civilian markets decades after they were built. Walnut Ridge wasn't an isolated act of post-war carelessness. It was the opening chapter of a pattern that has repeated after nearly every American war since, a cycle of urgent wartime creation followed by ruthless peacetime disposal, driven by the simple, unsentimental logic of budgets and storage space. Stand on that runway in Walnut Ridge today, and it's almost impossible to imagine what was lost there. No wreckage, no monument marking the smelters, no rows of rusting fuselages to remind visitors of what happened. Just a small regional airport, quiet under the Arkansas sky, built on top of one of the strangest chapters in American military history, a place where the government destroyed with cold efficiency what it had built with wartime urgency, because peace, it turned out, had no use for 10,000 warplanes. So the next time you see grainy black and white photographs of fighters stacked vertically on an Arkansas runway, or a B-32 Dominator sitting silent beside a furnace, remember what those images actually represent. Not just old airplanes, the physical remains of the greatest industrial mobilization in American history, undone in less time than it took to build it in the first place. If this story surprised you, there are 5 more American airfields that hide almost identical secrets, and next time, we're heading to the Arizona desert to see what happened at Kingman. Subscribe so you don't miss it.